Okay, I think we've got enough people to go ahead and get started. I'm sure more people will be joining in. I think we're going to have a packed crowd. Thank you all for joining. This Zoom meeting, Zoom webinar is being hosted by Student Energy at UC Davis, which is a graduate student organization at UC Davis, whose mission is to build a community of energy leaders, share cross-disciplinary knowledge about the energy system, and take action to accelerate the transition to a resilient, decarbonized, and equitable energy future. Pretty much, it is a bunch of grad students trying to learn about decarbonization across disciplines. And we're hosting a series on the politics of different types of decarbonization in California. And this week we are talking about housing policy and how it affects climate, and both climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We've got 2 more webinars that are really exciting before the end of the school year. Next Thursday, we are hosting Matto Mildenberger, who is a political science professor at UC Santa Barbara, talking about labor and climate politics nationwide. Should be really exciting. Somebody that I've been excited to meet for a while. And then the week after that, on Tuesday, we have Leah Stokes, also a political science professor at UC Santa Barbara, talking about politics of decarbonization at the utility level. So you can find that information and more content at our new website, studentenergydavis.org. Check it out. Give us a follow on Twitter as well, and subscribe to our newsletter if you want to stay up to date. With that said, I will introduce our guest host and guest speaker in a moment. But first, just like to kind of introduce the topic really quick and sort of state my 2 cents about why I think talking about these issues are really critical. I think a lot of people in my department, which is the energy graduate group at UC Davis, have learned a lot about utilities and about electric vehicles and all sorts of ways to kind of decarbonize from that perspective. But it's become abundantly clear that California is doing well in decarbonizing in some areas, such as the electricity grid, but in transportation, it's quite behind. And one of the big issues is that everyone's driving all the time, and most of the cars are still internal combustion engines. And so it's become very clear that one of the most critical areas for climate, people that believe in climate action to put their energy, is in policy changes that affect the ways that we use land and the ways that we zone land in order to allow for more efficient and denser and more equitable, hopefully more affordable housing. So I think all these issues are super connected, but I'm very excited today to hear from 2 people that are experts in this subject, know a lot more than I do. So we're going to do this sort of in a style of moderated interview, where the interviewer is Amy Lee, who is a PhD student at UC Davis in transportation policy. Amy works with Dr. Susan Handy and studies the political coalitions surrounding housing policy in California. But previously, she worked for 7 years at the Sacramento Area Council of Government, or SACOG, where she was a planner and research analyst. And so Amy knows these topics super well, and is going to be kind of having a conversation with our guest, Annie Fryman, who is the chief legislative aide to State Senator Scott Wiener, who's one of the more high-profile state senators working to change housing policy in order to upzone and allow more housing near transit, among other things, of course. Amy was the critical staffer for several high-profile state Senate bills, including Senate Bill 35, Senate Bills 827 and 828, and most recently, Senate Bills 50 and 127, among others. And her background is in architecture before she moved into policymaking. So it's an honor to introduce both of our speakers today, and please keep your microphones on mute, and we're gonna do questions through the chat box, and they will be moderated at the end. We'll try to get through as many as we can through the chat box, so feel free to put them in the chat, and if either speaker feels like addressing them in the moment, they can. Otherwise, we will try to get to them towards the end. So we're planning for about an hour of this moderated conversation, and then 20 minutes of question and answer, ending at 8:30. So once again, thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Amy.
Great, thanks, Jake. I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I'm excited to be able to chat with Annie for the next hour and a half. So a little bit about the format. We're going to start a bit with some background about ourselves, and then we'll kind of start chatting about housing policy in California, about some stuff around suburban sprawl, the legislative efforts that have happened in California, what might be next for California, policy-wise, given these uncharted grounds that we're now in, or waters that we find ourselves in. Annie, do you want to go first, or do you want me to kick it off? Do you have a preference? All right,
yeah, feel free to go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So yeah, thank you, Jake. I've been at UC Davis for a while now, though I'm kind of meeting some of you for the first time, I think, because I am in the transportation policy graduate group. My research, I've been around in the graduate group since about 2015. My research has focused primarily on the nexus between land use and transportation, primarily around travel behavior. And I have really gone upstream in a lot of my work, in that I look at the policy making around transportation, decision-making, investments, land use policies. I've spent a while looking at how we measure transportation and its impacts. And of course, in California, you can't look at measuring transportation impacts without talking about vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. I got into all of this because of my interest in environmental policy and climate change. So being a planner in California, thinking about climate change, that is absolutely squarely in the looking at vehicle miles traveled, how much people drive, and the land use patterns that engender those miles that people have to travel, that bring about the travel patterns that we have. You can look up some of my work. I've done a lot of work with the California Environmental Quality Act, how we've changed from looking at congestion a bit to how we look at the amount of driving. I've looked at transportation revenues and investments and how we're spending a bunch of our transportation money, so on and so forth. And so I think I'll kick it. Well, I'm going to say one more thing and then I'll hand it over to Annie. The way that I landed here today is because with an energy graduate group, a lot of the energy demand in California while a lot of the emissions that are from energy in California are from transportation. And a lot of the ways that we talk about transportation emissions is because of the carbon content of fuels. We all kind of know this traditional triangle, the three-legged stool of trying to decarbonize transportation. The carbon intensity of fuels, the vehicle fuel efficiency, and then the amount that people actually have to drive. And so I'm in that third bin of people thinking about how much people drive. And so, of course, in California, if you're thinking about land use patterns, if you're looking at those kinds of things, you head into the housing arena very quickly, because California not only has climate policy going on and has been pretty unprecedented in its climate policy, but also we have several housing crises going on as well. And so with those all in mind, Jake tapped me and Annie to come talk about how housing and changing how we think about the status quo of our housing patterns, and how we think about housing policy relates to energy by way of how people get around and how buildings perform. So as you have questions about that, feel free to chime in, but I'll now hand it over to Annie. You can talk about how you got here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy, and Jake, and everyone who is here today. So my name is Annie Fryman. I'm a legislative aide focusing primarily on housing policy for Senator Wiener, but also transportation as well, and some local government overlap between those two. I work primarily out of the state capitol in Sacramento, though I do keep somewhat of a personal home base in San Francisco, and actually prior to ending up in the state capitol, I had lived in San Francisco. So a little bit just by way of background in terms of where I got to where I am today, and then I know Jake and Amy wanted me to dive into a little bit of what it's like working in the Capitol and working as a staffer and what really that entails, particularly in the ways that are relevant to the topics at hand. So housing, transportation, climate, et cetera. So as Jake mentioned in the beginning, my background's actually in architecture. I studied design in college. I ended up in San Francisco after school, working as a designer at a small architecture studio, primarily focused on small, like urban infill residential development, frankly, the unsexy types of building that most of us live in and spend most of our time in. And I really, really got into the nuts and bolts, not just of, as I often joke, drawing right angles for a living, which is a lot of what beginning as an architect is, but also how policies and codes and all of these kind of like more man-made things really act as parameters for architects and for planners and for other folks. So my job, quickly as a designer went from, drawing right angles and doing renderings and kind of the more artistic parts of that work to spending more and more time downtown at the building department and negotiating with city planners and negotiating with the city and all of these decision makers along the way that make it possible and easier or harder for you to do that work of building more homes for people in ways that they need. So I made a little bit of a, I don't know what you would call it, unexpected move from architecture. I got into a bunch of community organizing around like housing reforms and affordable housing in San Francisco. And then I made the move into policy from there and housing and land use. I originally was working in City Hall in San Francisco, which is where I met then Supervisor Scott Wiener. And I was one of his 3 aides focusing on housing and land use. It was technically meant to be a temporary job at the time. I didn't really know if I was going to do it forever. He was in the middle of a campaign. Things sort of spun from there. And next thing I know, we're on the other end, and there's a slot for me to come work in Sacramento and do statewide housing policy. So it was very scary. I was like 24, 25 at the time. And I was just like, why not? And I moved up in 6 days notice. And kind of the rest is history. It's been 3.5 years now. And it's been a real roller coaster, I think. My first year was 2017, which was the year that 3 really extraordinary things happened in the legislature, all 3 of which are relevant to the conversation today. The first one was we passed a $53 billion infrastructure package for the state of California focused on transportation. So it was called SB1, and it was essentially raising the gas tax for all drivers in California and a few other things around vehicle registration and fees in order to pay for repaving our roads, rebuilding a lot of our like transportation infrastructure. We were able to, from the beginning of the initial proposed package to the end, negotiate to triple the amount of money for public transit in that broader package. That was a big accomplishment that we were very proud of during that. Then, you know, fast forward that was our first, I think, month or two in the legislature that most of that went down. So we like had no idea what was going on. Very much a crash course in transportation. Then you move on to the next phase, and it was the state trying to renew cap and trade, which obviously is, and you know, we probably won't go into too much detail about it today, and I'm sure you all are somewhat familiar, but it's a program in California, obviously, to cap and then essentially create a market for carbon emissions in the state with the goal of over time dramatically reducing them. And it was time for a renewal. And so obviously there's a lot of broader policy questions and then therefore policy fights and political fights that come up along the way in what really is considered as we have the opportunity to reshape this really, really critical kind of like, I believe at the time it was the first in the nation program when it was first adopted. So that was, you know, months 3 and 4 of that first year. And then in the background of all of this and culminating over the summer, that July, was the 2017 housing package that the legislature and primarily the Senate had really, really put together, that actually I had the privilege of being at the smack dab in the center of the linchpin bill for that package, which was SB 35. And we might go into a little bit more detail on that later today, but essentially that bill was focused on streamlining what we sort of decided based on policy values was high quality housing development. So taking into account what types of construction labor are used on those projects. Are they good paying jobs for workers and dignified working conditions? How much affordable housing? Is it on urban infill sites? Is it close to public transportation? All of these things. And then how do we give those projects a leg up to incentivize more of those projects from happening? So all that's to say, that was like our first 8 months in Sacramento as someone with relatively little experience, just kind of like thrown in the deep end. And it was a really, really exciting time. And since then, we've been on a bit of a rocket ship, particularly around housing and also transportation. This is, for people who have been around a lot longer than me, they definitely say this is the first time in decades that housing has been such a consistent and prolonged and prominent part of the broader conversation and legislative priorities outside of just a few, you know, couple members with that pet project here and there. And it's been a real privilege to be a staffer really central to and privy to a lot of those conversations and negotiations and seeing the nuances and the really difficult, not just trade-offs, but like challenges that the state is facing. You know, rural housing challenges look different than urban housing challenges. Coastal housing challenges look different than inland housing challenges. Northern California and Southern California are very different. And I think that this time has given me a lot of information, I guess, to really appreciate the depths of how challenging this problem is. Obviously, if it were easy to solve, we would have solved it long ago, and it would not have gotten this bad for so long. And it's not just the housing affordability crisis, but it's also that nexus with climate as well and with transportation. And those three are very, very linked. And I know that's what we're going to focus on today. But I guess all in summary, it's been, like I said, a real privilege to, you know, be having this role and be central to a lot of those conversations that are happening. And I've definitely been learning a lot along the way, as well as having the opportunity to go from basically the earliest phase of my career from a practitioner, being sort of on the other side of the building permit counter, trying to use the laws that we now acknowledge are broken and need to get fixed, and kind of banging my head against the wall, wanting so badly for them to work when they weren't. And then really having the position of agency to be on the other side of that and, you know, tinker at all the different levers and see all the different ways that we can fix things and bring all the smartest people into the room and get their feedback and really have a much more collaborative environment around how can we solve these problems that have been so vexing, but also because we've been so scared to solve them for so long, they've only gotten worse and more challenging over time. So I guess I'll kind of leave it at that. That's a little bit of an intro, both I guess on the focus of my work as well as how I got here. And I'm sure more of that will come up along the way, but that's my hello, I'm Annie.
That's great. All right, so let's just dive right into it, because I think that gave us a really good primer to start talking about the kind of these wicked problems that you just described. But yeah, if these are easy to solve, You know, there are always obstacles to solving them, but and kind of laying out some of the problems. I think about these a lot. Things like basically the big landscape in California. We have autocentric suburban sprawl, is an incredibly carbon intensive land use pattern, and it's also incredibly prevalent, a very prevalent land use pattern in California. And I think that, and it's also it's a land use that was designed in many ways to segregate people. It has really big implications, and it's a huge causal factor in inequities. I like to think of all the ways that suburban sprawl can be talked about, and what kind of like role it plays in outcomes that we're trying to battle right now. And so it's this hallmark of California in many ways. And you have just given us a little sneak peek, but what are kind of some of these big picture land use reforms, like policies, like not even like specific policies, but what's the big picture of the policy landscape around land use in California, things that have been proposed, things that it's been pushed on by advocates, things that it has enacted? Kind of like, what is the legislature thinking about in terms of that big problem?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I would also argue it's not enough, but there's a lot going on. I think I'll separate in terms of categorizing them. I actually, for my own mental model, think of the two really distinct buckets in terms of how the legislature and, you know, the people in that policy ecosystem surrounding the legislature approach these broader systemic land use issues. There's to the extent that California does any central planning, which I would argue is like a 5 out of 100 relative to what we've seen in other parts of the world, for better or worse, I would say that one of the backbones of California land use policy, and this is kind of in the first bucket, is this process that was created in like the 1970s called the housing element. And it's there's a whole world of policy that revolves around it, and there are a lot of things that we've been changing in the housing element. And I will use this term called RHNA, which is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. When I say the word RHNA, think of it as like the housing quota that the state gives each individual city for their goal for how much housing they need to account for and ideally build over the next 8-year cycle. So every 8 years, the state of California goes through this crazy process that we've sort of rewritten several times. And at the beginning of it, they sort of get all this just demographic data. And at the end of it, they spit out a number where they say, Sacramento built 3,000 units of housing, Davis built 1,000 units of housing, San Francisco built 50,000 units of housing, and everyone gets a number. So that is really the main web and bucket that any kind of centralized planning when it comes to housing really goes through. We have this system, it's flawed in many ways, but it works in some ways, and we've been tinkering around the edges of fixing it and made some other meaningful reforms. So in the RHNA bucket, I would say that a little bit before my time actually, and Amy might be able to speak to this better than I can, but there was a bill called SB 375, which I think really kicked off a lot of this housing, transportation, climate nexus between the three of these. And Amy, cut me off if I misdescribe this, because again, I only have this abstract understanding post-implementation, but essentially there was a bill SB 375, it was in the early 2010s, and essentially what it did is it tried to align the places that we are putting housing and concentrating housing in every region with also the like air quality and emissions goals for that reason. So there are obviously places in every region that have more jobs, that have more transit, that are more resource and energy efficient places for people to live, such that each individual person is consuming less. And so the same population would have a bigger or smaller footprint. And then also tying that in and folding that in with these sort of broader transportation plans that we have to meet federal requirements. And so it really is all three parts of that triangle: air quality and carbon emissions, transportation, and then housing, and sort of where housing and planning our growth in terms of where people live fits into that equation. So that was one of the big things that really kicked us off in the last decade. Then you sort of get to 2010, or actually 2018. and you have two really big RENA reforms. So in that same bucket, you have a bill called SB 828, which my office authored, which is probably like one of the projects I'm most proud of in my time with Senator Wiener. And essentially that bill was meant to and was focused on making sure that the RENA process, so that process where every single city gets assigned a number of housing units, that process is not able to be weaponized and politicized in the ways that we've seen it been abused in the past, and actually is much more based on facts, based on actual housing need, based on places where people are actually trying to live, based on location efficiency in terms of that same thread of where can we create and account for more growth in the places where people are already trying to be, such that we're not creating pressure further and further out into the suburbs and the greenfields, because that's where it's cheaper to build. So there's always that tension. SB 828 is sort of in this implementation over time. It did pass. It was sort of a huge success, and we're seeing it. It's been implemented in 2 regions in Southern California. Sacramento region is sort of in the later stages of implementing it and adopting it right now. The Bay Area is in the earlier stages of that, and we'll see it over the course of the next few years throughout the rest of the state. There was another RENA bill that year, AB 1771, was authored by a Los Angeles legislator that was really focused, I'll give the caveat, it was less focused on the climate angle, frankly, and that was one of the criticisms of the bill, but it was very focused on fair housing and equity and making sure that communities that have historically been able to be exclusionary towards poor people, towards people of color, places that were traditionally on the other side of redlining, the places where the whiter and wealthier folks were living and able to live and then continue to remain segregated over time, that was much more explicitly tackled in RENA to make sure that we don't perpetuate these cycles and patterns of exclusion that we've really baked into so many of our city laws and state laws, sometimes purposefully and sometimes inadvertently, but the effect is still the same. So those two together are actually very powerful, because you have the very explicitly fair housing and equity lens through 1771, and then you have this, let's depoliticize the process, let's make it more tied to reality in terms of need, let's make sure places are location efficient, and let's make sure that we're using the right inputs to determine actually what the need is, especially if RENA is going to be used as a proxy for, are you doing a good or bad job on housing, which sort of is another pattern that we're seeing. So outside of the RENA, so I would say those 3 bills are sort of focused on this kind of like second degree, like Wizard of Oz guy behind the curtain stuff around land use, where for folks who are really in the weeds, it's something that we pay a lot of attention to and kind of tinker around the edges, but it's not the blockbuster policy that really resonates with people firsthand. That bucket is the project specific policy. And so the first one is the like high level planning, abstract, nothing is concrete. The second one that's project specific, that's the building on your corner, or that big project downtown, or that thing that you're reading about in the news. And it's when, if that policy is or is not successful, there's like a concrete building that will or will not get built. It is much more tangible. It gets a lot more people involved and invested, both for better and worse. It kind of brings a lot more supporters and a lot more enemies. And it's also smaller scale, right? Because it's on this sort of like whack-a-mole, case-by-case, project-by-project basis. However, you can still, especially at the state level, with the right types of policies, make really meaningful impacts on that. So I would say the bucket of those, particularly coming out of our office, were SB 35, which essentially made it such that projects that might have gotten, for reasons that are very, I would say, outdated or invalid, like held up in a lot of process and sometimes like fake environmental review process that doesn't necessarily help the environment in the ways that we originally intended, make sure that good projects get through very quickly. So a project that might have previously taken 6 years to get approved and get shovels in the ground, under SB 35 would take 2 to 3 months. Mm-hmm. And that was a policy that, even though that's a project by project level thing, at the state level, now we've seen hundreds of housing projects take advantage of this. And if you can just imagine like that scale in your head, this law has been in effect for a little over 2 years. We've seen hundreds of projects, many tens of thousands, particularly of affordable housing units, that have been able to take their time down from 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years down to 2, 3 months. So that's, I think, the scale, that's really exceptional that we can work at the state level in a state as big and diverse as California. And then I know we're going to be talking a lot today about SB 827 and SB 50, which was our much more explicit zoning reform work. And I think that you can maybe argue is a little bit of a hybrid between this sort of like, you know, statewide focus on zoning and planning, but also the outcome is specific individual projects. And I won't get too in the weeds of it right now because I know we'll dive in different ways there, but essentially the crux of those bills was to increase the amount of housing that you're allowed to build near job centers, near public transportation, and in previously exclusionary areas. So places that have been segregated in a way that wealthier people have benefited from. How do we make sure to take proactive efforts to reintegrate those places, as well as make sure that people can live close to jobs, places they're trying to go, as well as close to public transit to reduce their driving. So I'll cut off there because I know we're going to dive into a lot of this stuff later on. But that's just a little bit of the big picture reforms and the focus, particularly during my time, the last 3.5 years in the legislature, and where folks' thinking on how to shape and approach land use reform has gone.
Great. That's a great overview. Thanks. So we are just on the diving board about to go into SB 50, but I do want to ask if there are any questions from you all about kind of the big picture ideas that we're talking about before we start getting into the weeds a little bit more. They say that we should wait a few seconds longer than feels comfortable to allow for any.
Like from like the Zoom webinar guide 101.
Exactly.
Okay, I have a question. The
sure.
SB 35 is explicitly about CEQA reform, or is it?
No.
What kind
it's sort of a rhetorical thing. Like it basically SB 35. The biggest thing, though not the only thing SB 35 does, is take a certain segment of housing projects out of CEQA. So you could argue that that's a CEQA reform in the sense that it makes things that CEQA used to touch no longer touch it, but at the same time, it didn't affect the law of CEQA. It actually changed what was qualified or what was eligible for CEQA to consider. And I know that's a little bit rhetorical. It's some sort of my political answer. But yeah, one of the things SB 50 did was take out both the surface area and contact of CEQA for both timing and predictability reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can speak to that just a little bit if it's helpful. But so CEQA is it's a very, very impactful law in California. I'm not sure how widely it's talked about on the energy side of things, but so if any sort of decision that's going through a public body like a city council, or if there is a, say, project that needs to go through a city council for approval as opposed to being approved what we call ministerially or by right, like if I'm a staff planner and I can say, yes, this complies with zoning and all of the required conditions of a certain parcel, I can sign off on that and it goes right through. If there is a project that has to go to a city council, it becomes a discretionary project and then we get CEQA. And so the way that something is decided upon, that's kind of that contact and surface area that Dan's talking about. It's really huge reform in the timing of a project and how quickly it can go. So,
and I think another, just to jump in really quickly, a way that I have been able to sort of frame it to folks who are newer to the topic is, so for CEQA, basically it's the California Environmental Quality Act. It's essentially the way that we disclose and hypothetically mitigate environmental effects of decisions that are made by government. And so the line between if CEQA does or does not apply to a decision is, was the decision based on purely black or white, true or false, sort of objective criteria where there was no personal or subjective judgment used? So think of like, I don't know, you go to the DMV and you need to get your thing renewed and you pass a test and you sign a form and it's like pretty black or white if you did that or not. There's no like, oh, I felt this way, oh, they felt that way, oh, we need to negotiate and disagree. Then there are decisions like, for example, Amy said, where it goes to the city council or the planners are empowered to basically negotiate with the designer or negotiate with the developer. In every city that looks different, but the second that it goes from a black or white, true or false objective checklist to something that requires personal or subjective decision making, that's when the CEQA light goes off. And then you have to go through this long legal process to move forward with that project after the decision has been made.
Yeah. Okay. As much as I'd love to debate CEQA and chat about that all day long, we will not bore these lovely people. But okay, so SB 50, you've talked about that a little bit. You've given us a little tease. So it was one of the most, it was one of the highest profile housing bills that probably California has seen in a very long time. Certainly probably my generation, if not a couple more. What was SB 50 attempting to do? We'll start there.
Great question. So, and I'll talk about SB 50, but there was a precursor a year prior, SB 827, that really just sort of evolved into it. So when I say SB 50, I'm more talking about the long storyline that turned into SB 50. But in terms of what we were trying to accomplish, so I think that, you know, there's obviously a lot of different layers to this. At the simplest level, what we were trying to accomplish is acknowledge that the state of California, and particularly our population, is going to grow. We have a thriving economy, booming economy, particularly concentrated on the coastal metropolitan areas, though not exclusive to that. And we do not have enough housing in the state, particularly at levels that are affordable to people who are here for jobs. And that's a problem. And so what happens absent intervention and what happens with intervention and what would intervention look like, right? That's sort of, I think, the framing going into this. So our goal was taking as an assumption that this is going to happen no matter what. Do we let it sort of happen hands off, laissez-faire, and just build more suburbs, build more highways out to the suburbs, build more suburbs to the suburbs, put more cars in the freeway? Like, next thing we know, we have no farmland and we have roads everywhere, and what do? Or do we take a more long-term, you know, again, I hate to use the term central planning, but like a more intentional, centralized approach where we say, okay, what are the values of this state? What are the values of people and regions? What are the things that we care about? And how do we make sure that our land use policy is aligned with that, right? We care about equity, we care about opportunity, we care about affordability, and we care about climate. And so what is the long-term plan from there? And so really, I mean, I think at its core, the earliest versions of SB 50 and 827, it was this really simple, like, why does California let us spend gajillions of dollars on public transit infrastructure and then let cities say that no one can live near it? That doesn't make any sense. Let's fix that. And sort of from there, so many more issues like came to the surface and bubbled up and sort of came further under the umbrella. But at its core, really, it was, why are our both spending priorities so misaligned with our land use priorities, as well as just the broader values that we broadly share as a state, so misaligned with the patterns that we're seeing in our land use, and how can we recalibrate them together?
Great. So maybe we can dive into the nuts and bolts. How was SB 50 and, or, you know, 827 and then an SB 50? What were you tinkering with to better align California's transportation and housing and land use?
Yeah, so we were tinkering with zoning, which is a very hot button term on housing Twitter and in very certain circles, and a very boring term everywhere else. But I mean, at its core, zoning is essentially what the law says you are and are not allowed to build on any specific parcel or property or neighborhood. And so zoning is this sort of line that stops us from building apartment buildings near the train station, right? Or townhouses near the office park or whatever. It's like, what are you allowed to build? What would people build if not for that specific obstacle? And I'm being very reductive here because there's obviously financial considerations, et cetera. But we were tinkering with zoning, and essentially what we said was, and it's evolved over time, but by the final version, it was within these areas and radii around public transportation, around job centers, and around like areas of privilege, essentially, that are, you know, segregated by a number of different indicators. We are going to essentially set statewide parameters and guidelines and minimums for how much a local government is allowed to restrict housing in those areas. And the goal was, why should we have this really like ticky-tacky, decentralized, like conflicting approach to letting every local government figure that out for themselves when these are statewide values? So you should definitely allow mid-rise apartment buildings near the train station. You should definitely not make apartment buildings illegal near areas very close to job centers, and also areas of privilege and exclusion, where zoning has historically been one of the things that has been weaponized to promote racial exclusion. And so I would say, I mean, really that's the core of what we were focused on. It's like reversing apartment bans, I think is the simplest way to put it. I will say, however, one of the things, I know we're going to dive into the politics of it in a second, but just to sort of give a tease, one of the challenges with that, not just from a technical perspective, but politically, is that California throughout its history has had this extraordinary tradition and almost mythology around local control. And sort of this idea that like at the most hyper local level, people should be controlling their own destiny. And so when that's at odds with the broader public good, like how do we reckon with that? And so one of the real political challenges that we've hit was not just the, do people agree on the merits, but how do we grapple with this really historic inversion of like, why is the state telling us what we can and can't build above the corner store on 18th Street? Like, who are they to tell us? That's our job as like the hyper local corner neighborhood city council guy. That's not for some senator to tell us. So that's a dynamic that I think it plays out in a lot of different ways in these housing and land use conversations. And from what I know and understand, this is a historic sort of like transition period when that conversation is gaining momentum more than it ever has before. But that's what SB 50 was trying to accomplish. And that's sort of one of the at least thematic obstacles that we've hit on top of the other just sort of political and operational ones.
Yeah, great. And chiming in a little bit with some of the things that I have looked at, I think Annie made a really good point about this nexus between public spending and these upward more than $10 billion that California spends a year in transportation investments. I've spent some time looking at that. And if we are spending our collective tax dollars on transit and on all of these different types of, well, we could spend more on transit, but if we're spending all of this money on our transportation infrastructure, and then we have a piecemeal system for deciding what can go near that transportation infrastructure and that those buses and those light rails, we're getting a mismatch in governance. We have a state level strategy and kind of high level regional strategy for our transportation. And we have this local approach to land use, which is oftentimes self-interested. Also, I'll say that you get a self-interest from the way of the local governments to put what they want. They don't want the thing over the corner store on 18th Street. They like it how it is, and just because there happens to be a really high, a muni station there or a BART station doesn't mean that they should be told what goes where. You start to get a really big inefficiency, not just from our public spending, but also just who can use who has access to low carbon transportation. Yeah, great. I'll pause again for questions.
It looks like someone named Steve said, what are the enforcement mechanisms under SB 50? I can answer that in a kind of oblique way. So SB 50, the way that it worked is it essentially, like, we were criticized for this and applauded for this, but it was a fact nonetheless. The enforcement mechanism was just that it is now state law that regardless of what your local law says, you are allowed to do X. And so it was less of a matter of like, could individual people violate it? And it was more, frankly, a question, you know, when you bring up enforcement around what happens if a city doesn't honor that, right? So what happens if it's the city breaking the state law as opposed to some independent private actor? There are ways throughout the legal system, broadly in housing law. Housing Accountability Act is the main one that comes to mind, and it essentially, that enforcement mechanism is that it creates a legal process to sue a local government for mishandling state housing law. I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but that's the best way that I think I can answer it. And I'll let Amy jump in.
I don't know a ton about that.
Or I just saw you raise your hand. Okay.
Oh, no, sorry. It was not. No. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's all I have to say on
Okay.
enforcement mechanisms. So.
Okay. There is, all right, let's go even further into inside baseball of SB 50 and its siblings. So kind of what is your general thought, like what's your general estimate, what were the general estimates about how something like SB 50 would affect both the housing supply in California, the like housing affordability, and then like accessibility of California's communities? So like the transportation emissions, I'll use the term accessibility in kind of interchangeably with transportation emissions.
Mm-hmm.
What was like your office's estimate around that? What were you thinking around those?
Yeah. So I'll answer in two parts. So I'll just throw out some numbers that hopefully can ground the conversation answer a little bit. So the biggest argument in housing world right now around California's housing supply shortage, which is overlapping but distinct from the affordability crisis that we're in, is, does California have a housing shortage of 3.5 million homes or 4 million homes? That's really where like a lot of the fighting happens, is 3.5 to 4, but there isn't a whole lot of fighting outside of it. So if you're grounded in that 3.5 to 4 million, whichever number you choose, there was a very, not politically, but just in terms of methodology, conservative study that was done actually the year prior to SB 827 that focused just on modest upzoning around like capital transit stations. So that means like bus rapid transit and rail stations. And so a more modest upzoning in fewer places was estimated by McKinsey in this like very, very long report to close that gap by 1.5 to 2 million homes. So essentially, a more modest solution than SB 50 was expected to close roughly half of California's housing shortage. And granted, that was income agnostic, which is again sort of like an overlapping, I don't want to say complication, but consideration that we need to take into account. But just to get to the scale or sort of ground people in the scale of the solution, one single law being able to close California's gap by a conservative estimate of 50% is roughly what we were functioning under and what was rarely challenged. So I'll sort of leave that in terms of like the housing supply estimate. In terms of the transportation estimate, the modeling on that is much harder, so I'm not going to pretend to like throw numbers out there that I can't back up. I will say, however, that the California Air Resources Board, which is a state agency that you are probably familiar with, that's exceptionally sophisticated, they have issued many reports, one of which has said, you know, Californians must reduce driving by 25% by 2030, and that must include significant aggressive land use and changes, not just electrification of personal vehicles. Also, additionally, the Air Resources Board has issued reports putting out this like staggering number that still blows my mind every time I say it, but 40% of California carbon emissions are personal passenger transportation. So that's not like freight on I-5. This is just people driving in their Camry. in their Subaru, in their Escalade, in their whatever you're driving to get to work, to do your errands, for your job, all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So
the biggest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in California.
Yeah, it's truly mind-blowing. I don't believe it every time I think it, and then I go back and check the report and I remind myself it's true. And so, obviously I don't have a credible way to model how much SB 50 would reduce that. But what I can say is that one of the things that California is privileged to have, that I think we're in this moment where we have the opportunity to really squander this, and we're kind of on track to squandering it, and it would be a real shame, is that the demand for where people are trying to live in California, economically speaking, is broadly in the lowest footprint areas, right? Generally speaking, people want to live in cities at this point in history. They want to live near city centers. They want to live in areas where they have very low VMT. And the main barrier is cost and affordability. And a lack of housing supply is one of the contributors to that. And so, come in a bill like SB 50 that could really meaningfully concentrate a flood of housing development for people at all income levels in the place where there's already this extraordinary demand for people to live with very low footprints. That's very powerful. Like I said, I'm not going to make up a number, but just to sort of ground us in what does that pie chart of California's emissions look like? Where do they come from, and where do we need to go? Should a policy like SB 50 or something that has the same effect as SB 50 be successful in the near future, that is very powerful and truly could turn around the ship for California if and when we get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. Great. So can we talk about the politics of SB 50 and 827 and all of these things? We won't drag you.
Where do you want to start?
Yeah, we won't drag you through too much trauma, but we have the policy making side, but the politics of SB 50 were just out of control. Just like,
I feel these like wrinkles around my eyes.
Yeah, right. I think you introduced a few people to Ledge TV.
Yeah.
So there were lots of loud coalitions. There are lots of coalitions. There are lots of odd alliances, loud opposition. Can you just kind of like briefly give us like the cliff notes of what happened? And I'll give the spoiler. Ultimately, SB 50 fell short and didn't pass in January of this year after a very circuitous pathway to the Senate floor even. So
yeah,
I don't know, your short version when you don't want to talk to your family at Thanksgiving and when they ask you how your year went.
It was like okay, I'll spare the bad jokes. Okay, so in terms of the politics of SB 50, and I'll be very brief, and then you can sort of pepper me because I don't really know what direction we want to go with this. There were a few major fault lines that really evolved from the first version of 827 to the final version of SB 50 that failed in January. One of the fault lines are, I would say, this spectrum politically of folks who on the left are primarily focused on tenants having housing security, on advocacy for low-income people, and on anti-gentrification and anti-displacement efforts. I would say you move further along that spectrum, and then like on the far right are the like hyper-conservative, super NIMBY homeowner groups, and by extension, the cities and the elected officials that represent them and the political power that they represent, who essentially are a combination, depending on how generous I'm going to be, of people who just don't want change, for whatever reason. They're happy with the way things are, and a bill that's going to change things potentially quickly is very scary. And a less generous interpretation, frankly, is people who historically have very much benefited financially and otherwise from the things that the masses of California have suffered from, right? So that's inequities in places where we allow housing. That's really good air quality when a lot of people are in places of very bad air quality. That's, inflated property values for whatever reason. There's definitely a strong, not just undertone, but in many ways, in places, explicit thread of like racial discrimination as well. That is, baked into America's history, but still, in 2020 comes up in ways that are more explicit than anyone would assume going into this fight with wide eyes and a naive brain. And so I would say that like that's certainly one of the fault lines in terms of like how do you toe that balance, right? Like those two groups really represent things that are at polar opposites from each other, and like nothing that makes one of them happy will make the other one happy, and for understandable reasons. We made the decision, I think, well, during SB 827, I think that we are getting hit from both sides, frankly. Like, I mean, read the articles, you can watch the testimonies, read the letters. Like, the honest answer is we were really getting hit from both sides and trying to like thread the needle and balance somewhere between the two. We took a different approach with SB 50 and actually tried to much closer, like, ally ourselves and work collaboratively with the folks on the left. And work with the folks, advocating for low-income folks, with the folks doing tenant defense and tenant security, making sure that there is not any risk or perception of gentrification or displacement in communities. And our strategy was to isolate the neighborhoody people politically. So it's like you get everyone, including this, frankly, like more challenging coalition that we had not necessarily been in lockstep with before, to just ice out the other folks. And our hope is that we could like link arms and like run through and beat them. We got close, but we didn't get there. The other fault line that I say cropped up is regionally. So regionally in California, obviously you have like the Bay Area and then Southern California, kind of anchored in the Los Angeles region. And then inland, you have like a whole diversity of different types of inland and particularly more rural communities. But the war in terms of just population and therefore representation in the legislature was really between the Bay Area and LA. And Los Angeles County has 10 million people. 1 in 4 Californians live in Los Angeles County, which means 1 in 4 legislators represents Los Angeles County in that region. And so we were not successful at really executing on a winning strategy to get like full buy-in from the Los Angeles region in the way we were broadly in a lot of parts of the Bay Area and other regions. And I think that was another fault line, frankly, that I could go into a lot of theories about why that happened, but that was definitely one of them that became more apparent over time.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that at some point. Where, I know that the environmental group is not a monolith. There are lots of different environmental groups in California. Where did they kind of orient in this constellation of coalitions?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The environmental community, I will say as a generalization, was supportive, but not without exception. So there were far more large, incredible environmental organizations kind of throughout the spectrum that were supporting the bill actively, and some who were supporting it tacitly. There was a little bit of pushback from, I think, some of the more extreme groups, primarily focused on, frankly, just this like thread that I mentioned earlier, that I think a lot of Californians, regardless of their advocacy or political orientation, like local control really, really, really is embedded into so much of how we do things in California, and the environmental movement is no exception. And so I would say within the environmental community, there was really a split within that coalition of advocates between folks who acknowledge that in order to meet our broader climate goals, reducing VMT, building infill housing, saying yes to good things while we simultaneously say no to bad things, was really the proactive approach that was the appropriate amount of muscle that environmental advocacy deserved. And then there was a different school of thought in the environmental community, which was the locals know best, right? Each of our individual communities knows best for what's, for our environment, but really fill in that blank with anything else. Environmentalists are defenders. We never play offense. And so really there was like this offense versus defense. There was this, that same line of, what is our master plan versus is it local control? that was sort of like how the matrix fell. But the environmental folks were broadly supportive. You know, everyone could have always been louder, but they were definitely prominently in the conversation through the majority of it.
Was there ever kind of a coalition that you, or a voice that you wish chimed in that wasn't in the discussion or in those debates? I don't know if that makes.
Yeah, it's a hard question. Wait, are we talking about the environmental community still, or just
No,
like
no,
broadly?
sorry, in the overall.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we struggled with during SB 50, and that if I could wave my magic wand, would have happened differently, is for that second round that sort of ended this January. We had really, really worked hand in glove with most of the like equity oriented groups throughout the state. So like social and racial equity, making sure that, anti-gentrification, anti-displacement provisions were in play. There was active anti-poverty provisions to really like lift up folks in a way that was fair and equitable, et cetera. And within that coalition, there's also like really extraordinary diversity of thought. One of the things that I did learn, though, is that coalition they're very, very, very good at being a united front on the outside, even when they're not on the inside. And so, it was disheartening for me to often get private phone calls from prominent folks within those coalitions being like, "Psst, I promise I support you, but I can't say it out loud." And I'd be like, why not? And I think I understand why that dynamic exists, and I think that they benefit from it more often than are harmed by it, just in terms of political power. But in terms of like, if I could wave my magic wand, I think that there were a lot of like really incredible people on both sides of the debate within that coalition. And I think bringing a little bit more oxygen to that and daylight would have helped the bill not just improve in terms of the sophistication of the policy, but also really propelled forward the public conversation around how you put equity front and center in land use reforms and in housing. And like a lot of that was happening behind the scenes, but it wasn't really given the daylight that I feel like it deserves.
And there were a huge amount, there were phenomenal revisions that happened between age 27 and 50, and I can't imagine how much work you did there. What were just you kind of hinted at what some of those revisions were. Could you just kind of spell them out a little bit, and like how they were responding to some of the criticism?
Yeah, I hope I haven't blocked out like the whole thing, but I will say like at a high level, over time, so SB 27 just focused on transit, and I think that that's an important thing to be grounded on. SB 27 was the first version. We were just focused on public transit, so both rail as well as buses. In response to some of the criticisms of SB 27, we came back the next year, and we also had this focus on these areas of privilege and exclusion and areas very close to job centers. And that was sort of what I mentioned earlier. That came later, and it was in response to constructive feedback that we had gotten, which was essentially that, one, there are communities where they have been successful not just at keeping out housing, but also keeping out transit. And that doesn't necessarily by default mean it's bad to build there. Those communities might be very low VMT and very low carbon footprint and very equitable places to put housing. But just because they don't have transit there doesn't necessarily by law mean that they should be completely out of the running. And then I think further, and this was one of the things I was really excited about from a climate point of view in SB 50, was that by adding this sort of index that we had worked with these incredible coalition of academics to develop, we were able to not just say, are you close to public transit? Because that will mean you'll drive less, but also create this job proximity index by saying, are you close to the place that you're trying to go, right? Because we all know that transportation is not just you drive less because you take the bus. You also drive less when you're close to where you're trying to go. I often use the example, I'm sure a lot of you here are familiar with the city of Sacramento. I used to live at 20th and P in Midtown, and I wasn't close enough to public transit to qualify under SB 827 for transit proximity. I didn't have a car. My VMT was literally 0. I biked everywhere. I walked to work. I could do that. I was right by the grocery store. I was right by the Capitol. And there's so many places throughout California that it's not the public transit necessarily that makes people drive less. It's the fact that the communities were planned in a way such that the people who live within that radius are close to where they're trying to go. So that was, I think, what really closed that loop of the climate angle that we hadn't really yet perfected in 827. And so by not just focusing on transit, but also areas of exclusion and also job proximity, I think we added a lot of depth and sophistication and complexity that made it a better policy. We also went through probably like 11,000 million iterations of like the affordable housing component of the bill. And I couldn't even remember right now all of the different order of the schemes that we did, but those were in pretty direct collaboration, particularly in the round with SB 50, with this broad statewide working group around affordable housing, where the trade-offs were essentially, you know, like, what should we be cautious of? Should we be cautious of leaving too much affordable housing on the table and essentially like letting projects through that could have maybe squeezed out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more low-income units than we required? Or should we be cautious of requiring too much and then the project never gets built because the project and the developer can't afford the subsidy? And so I would say, like, without going into the detail of all the structure, that was really the guiding theme of a lot of the negotiation and a lot of the discussion was, you know, what should we be cautious of? Are we more cautious of the sort of like immediate hyper local potential impacts of having a little less affordable housing than we would in each individual community? Or are we more focused on the broad consequences of this policy not working in as robust a way as intended, and therefore not chipping away at the housing crisis as quickly and as swiftly as it could? So that was, I think, another, like, again, there's a whole evolution, but that was the theme that guided them.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. That's a good peek into the Pandora's box of, I think, what were your last few years. You mentioned something that I think goes nicely into this question that is on all of our minds is, you talked about the accessibility, I'll call it, of living in a place like downtown Sacramento, where you didn't actually live that close to quote unquote high quality transit, but you didn't actually use transit because you could walk and bike everywhere. You were in a place with really good multimodal accessibility, which I think is something that I think in this probably brave new world of what we're thinking about, of what does TOD look like if people aren't riding the T for the next, who knows, if people are not riding transit, and we don't even have transit running at full steam these days, and we don't know when that might be coming back, or when, we don't know what the future of transit is going to look like. Yeah, sorry, TOD is transit-oriented development. Can tell I'm an interloper in this energy world. But like, so how is, you know, like what's next for policy and housing policy and transit-oriented housing policy, kind of in light of this, of the pandemic, and then also just the political winds of Sacramento and what Governor Newsom has talked about, and what like Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins has said this is going to be the year of housing, and I don't think there's much housing stuff going on. At least it doesn't, you know, the legislative session is on a
tuned. Stay tuned. Announcements are imminent.
Oh, good. All right. Don't rule it out.
Yeah.
But yeah, so just the new agenda that has been put onto the table.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that? We have a new bill coming out of your office. What might we pay attention to in these next months or year? So.
Okay, man, those were a lot of questions all at once. So I'll try to be, cut me off if I get off track, but in order. So in terms of like, how should we be approaching housing and land use when we're used to doing it relative to transit, and now we don't know if transit agencies are going to stay afloat, if people will feel safe riding transit, what transit's going to look like in the near future, as well as like the medium term future. The answer I'm going to give that you all are not going to like because it's unhelpful is I don't know. In short, I think that like pandemic that we're in right now is it's still so sort of like new in terms of knowing what the long-term impacts are going to be. I mean, the difference, frankly, in people being given the option to work from home for the next month versus 9 months could be the difference between a significant number of our transit agencies going bankrupt, right? Like that's the reality at hand because of how much we in California, but just in the United States generally, refuse to subsidize public transit as infrastructure and public good in the way that I personally believe that we should. We depend so heavily on fares that as long as we are in this pandemic and we will not have the ridership, as well as we are simultaneously barreling into what is either a recession or a depression, depending on who you ask and what date it is. I don't know what the answer to that is, frankly. You know, the federal government is also a massive question mark in terms of what level of bailing out local governments and states and transitively their agencies and their funding mechanisms will be. So short answer is I really don't know. I'm personally very concerned and worried about the budget implications, just knowing how heavily our transit agencies depend on subsidies for operating their transit. So that's like that's things that are not like purchasing the bus or purchasing the train. That's like the maintenance of it and the drivers and the things that sort of like keep it going every day. I will say that independent of that, you know, the legislature, definitely in the 3.5 years that I've been there, and some would argue before to a lesser extent, and definitely moving forward, housing is a preeminent concern in people's minds. And so, you know, there will be a housing package, at least from the Senate, that will be introduced soon, that the Senate Pro Tem announced the intention to announce like a month or two ago. It was sort of a weird order of operations, but I do know that those announcements are imminent for kind of a broader like housing affordability and housing production package. I know that Amy sort of touched on this, and I saw a question in the chat regarding SB 902 and also just the broader conversation around fourplexes in the state and kind of like fourplexing or giving gentle density in different areas. SB 902 is our housing production bill for this year that we sort of introduced after SB 50 had failed. And essentially what it does is two main things. And they're pretty distinct from each other, but related. The first one is a very simple, depending on the size of your community, any low density area automatically becomes duplexes by right, triplexes by right, or fourplexes by right. So even if, similar to like SB 50, if the local government says you can only build single family homes, that doesn't matter if the state law says otherwise. And so it's sort of, in small communities, it's 2 units, in bigger communities, it's 4 units as the baseline minimum that you're allowed to build. The second part is actually a little more complicated, but frankly, far more impactful. And what I'm much more excited about is essentially it grants local control in the sense that a city is the one responsible for initiating this process. So it doesn't force it on anyone, but at the same time, we essentially make it easy as pie for a city to upzone their community in areas that are close to jobs, transit, or urban infill. And so as long as you're not promoting sprawl or like significantly increasing VMT or putting homes far from where people are working. Currently in California, if your city, so whether that be Davis or Sacramento or San Francisco or wherever it be, if they want to choose to upzone a neighborhood, they have to, you know, go through all of the community planning, work with the community, do the outreach. Then the planners have to come up with a proposal, and then they bring it to the city council. And to the explanation that Amy mentioned earlier about CEQA, even if that thing can get voted through, it still has to go through, in many cases, years of environmental review that can cost the city many millions of dollars. And that's if everyone is on board with doing it, which rarely happens in and of itself. And so you basically have a city begging to do something that is definitely going to be more environmentally sustainable, better for climate, better for transportation, better for housing equity. And they still have to spend many millions of dollars getting these arguably like redundant environmental documents to just corroborate that. And so what SB 902 does is it says, as long as your upzoning meets these parameters, no CEQA, pass it by a majority vote at your city council, it's done in a day. And that's like really kind of boring, but really, really exciting, particularly as we're entering a world where RHNA numbers are going to be exploding throughout the roof relative to what we've seen in the past. Cities are going to be required to do that zoning no matter what. So even though we say like the city gets to choose, the city's forced by all these other laws to do upzoning. So now we just say, do you want to do it the easy way or the hard way? Do you want to do it the cheap way or the expensive way? Mm-hmm. So that's the thing I'm most excited about. That bill is still alive. It's going to be moving forward. And yeah, keep your eyes peeled. I think we have a hearing next week, our first hearing.
Everybody mark your calendar.
Yeah.
That's really, yeah, it's really exciting to hear. And I think pulling it back together with the really political fight that happened around SB 50 last year and this year, like those fights also happen at every single city council. So that's a really huge shift that's going to happen on Tuesday nights all over the state.
Yeah. Oh, and one last thing, I just really quickly was going to mention, and I will post this in the chat afterwards. But on this question of transit, particularly like what is the future of transit? What are the agencies going through right now? The overlap with COVID. My office and Senator Wiener is actually hosting a big town hall webinar specifically focused on that question with a lot of leaders of enormous agencies, critics, transportation leaders this Thursday at 5 p.m. So I will post the information in the chat in case anyone's interested. It should be really exciting. I'm helping organize it. And we're pretty blown away with the speaker list that we got. We thought we'd get like half of them and somehow everyone said yes. So if you have free time and are interested, it would be great to tune in, and I'll post that in the chat.
Great. So we are pretty darn close to getting close to time. I know we have an entire tome of questions that we were going to maybe somehow talk about, but should we open it up to questions from you all?
Yeah, I have a quick question just before to get out of the way. What resources would you recommend? What people or area, either books or people to follow or places to look, would you recommend for energy students who are interested in learning more about this stuff?
Oh, that is a very good question. I guess I'll ask you more specifically. Do you mean like specific to the housing energy overlap, or just people trying to get oriented in all of the different considerations and factors at play in housing? Because I'll caveat and that I'm less well spoken on resources for the housing energy overlap, but could talk till midnight about the latter.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have. We have 10 minutes left. I think the latter is. I mean, I'm super interested in this topic, and I just have like followed as many people on housing Twitter as I can. But I think there's probably more professional ways to educate oneself
than the dumpster fire of housing Twitter.
Well, actually, Amy, I'll let you go first because you might have like the transportation, climate, potentially energy, like perspective far more sophisticated than me, because I'm like housing cave all the time, and Amy's a little more interdisciplinary. So
Sure. Yeah. Let me. So for those of you that are UC Davis students, I implore everyone I can talk to about this to take a planning class, to take an urban planning class. Whether you're an engineer, if you're thinking about building efficiency. So UC Davis offers one. It's the Environmental Science and Policy Department, ESP 171. If you want a really great summer, I'll be teaching it in August. And the textbook that we use for that, if you're looking for nuts and bolts of California planning and how this all fits together, is the Schulten and Figley Guide to, is that right? Fulton and Shigley Guide to California Planning. It's kind of the holy text of California planning. But then there's a lot of really good work that's been done. Like, for example, what I have been reading lately is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which goes into the historical, like it's all about housing and housing discrimination. If you want to get a sense of how we got where we are in terms of zoning and how it's been baked into our systems, that's a good one. In terms of more of the transportation side, man, lots of stuff that I'm thinking of are academic kind of papers. They're
Jake, I'll go through my bookshelf and I'll email you.
Yeah, we'll send out we can compile a list.
Yeah.
Sorry. Whenever you.
Yeah, well, just one thing. There are a bunch of well-informed people about this kind of thing in this conference. So if you all want to chat your favorites into the chat, you can go ahead and do that. I bet we can put together a pretty good reading list.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
A couple others that come to mind for me. If you're looking to just get wired into sort of like current events and reporting on like patterns that we're seeing like in real time in California, there's a journalist who's a really good friend of mine, but also just sort of like probably the state's most preeminent housing journalist, Liam Dillon at the LA Times. Used to be a part of the Sacramento Bureau, so reported almost exclusively on the Capitol and like state housing law and the overlap with the real world. And over the last year has moved down to LA and is doing much more community focused work. He also does a podcast that I saw just dropped in the chat, Gimme Shelter, with another reporter from Cal Matters, which is one of the nonprofit publications. That's a really good overview of like state housing policy and sort of the happenings in California. I would also say if you're looking for more academic work, someone who does really incredible work at this intersection, there's a guy named Michael Manville down at UCLA, who's sort of right at that like housing, transportation, and infrastructure with a particular like eye towards climate and financing, and sort of how like both public financing as well as the different incentives that we set up. But really is just an extraordinary leader and an exceptional person, and has published a lot of papers on a lot of the topics we've discussed today. Would have been a great like another panelist maybe for another time. And then Golden Gates is it was actually very, very recently published in the last few months, but a New York Times writer who was, I think, actually an econ writer, Connor Doherty. He published a book basically following around for the last like 5 or 6 years, a bunch of housing, people in the housing wars in the Bay Area and beyond, and published a book that's sort of narrative nonfiction around a lot of the bills that I've talked about today, but also like a lot of dominant like dynamics in labor unions and dynamics in tenants' rights and dynamics in the rent control movement and other things that we've not yet had a chance to discuss today, in a really, really sophisticated story that has gotten a lot of like critical praise. So that would also be another really good book for folks to read. It's also just like a fun read. It's written very well. But yeah, I would say Liam Dillon, both his writing and Gimme Shelter podcast, Michael Manville's papers that he's published out of UCLA. They're not boring, I promise. And then Golden Gates is another really exceptional read as well. But it's more Bay Area centric, just as a caveat.
Awesome. If you don't mind, Navy, I'm going to combine 2 questions, one of mine and one of an earlier ones that I think might wrap it up nicely. So I guess I'm curious, Annie, your kind of big picture motivation for your work. And to me, it seems pretty interesting this moment in California. We're in, and in a lot of states where tenant rights and housing justice and issues are coming to the forefront in a way more than they have recently. And at the same time, the climate justice movement is growing in power. We saw massive marches this fall for climate action, and yet it seems like there's still sort of a disconnect between some of the national kind of Green New Deal policy focuses and the housing density and the tenant movement as well? Like, what do you see as the big picture kind of potential for tenant justice and climate justice movements to overlap? And then this is related to someone's question. What gives you the most optimism and hope looking forward?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. I'll go with the first one first, which is, I think that, and there's a really, really good question about kind of like the Venn diagram of the climate justice and housing justice movements, and how there is some overlap, but they're also sometimes representing or allied with groups that we find or see at odds with each other, and how to reconcile that. A general, like, I don't want to say mental rule, but a way that I approach this as I'm trying to make sense of it is, say for example, like the proposal of the Green New Deal, that proposal is very much predicated on extraordinary public investment, not just in infrastructure, but also in the workforce. And when it comes to infrastructure and some sectors of our economy, I think there's much more historical precedent on the government taking like an extraordinary role. And we don't currently have that in housing in the United States. In the United States, the vast, vast, vast majority of housing is market housing. It's not non-market. It's not subsidized outside of like when we talk about Fannie Mae and like mortgages, as well as like different types of tax structures that frankly wealthier people benefit more than poorer people from. And so I think that like the medium term, ideally short term convergence will happen when we can really tie like a Green New Deal type framework and tie in how do we transition, and there's also a lot of very valid conversations that should be had about the pros and cons of this, and I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other, but right now, like, housing in the United States is at its core predicated on like capitalism working a certain way and the government playing a relatively tiny role. And I don't see an opportunity for like really, really strong linked arms overlap that doesn't include really extraordinary public investment in housing with an eye towards housing for lower income folks. And, you know, there are a lot of different models that people float around. The People's Policy Project out of Washington, D.C. put out a really interesting kind of like financing proposal for how you would cross-subsidize non-market housing. So have like social housing like you see in certain parts of Europe and like different parts of Asia, but also, you know, for people of all income levels, right? And like, what does that look like? And how do you actually make that work in a way that can reinforce each other? But at the same time, so much of our political system and our economy and the way our government is structured assumes that that's not the case, right? So like that transition, I actually think will be rockier, though many would argue more overdue than the conversations we're having broadly around a Green New Deal, because the Green New Deal is so focused on areas that we've already like broadly as a center of gravity as a country decided the government should have some role in. And I actually don't think we're there yet in housing. And I think we can get there. And I think there are a lot of smart people who will be, frankly, like on both sides of that fight. But that's where I see the convergence happening, frankly. And I don't know, Amy, if you have additional thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with your read on that. If we don't kind of have that, I don't think we have that kind of, the policy window hasn't shifted into that direction for housing or even let alone land use, I don't think. That's kind of goes back to that local control debate that
they still won't let us like change the rules such that capitalists can build housing. Like,
right. Right.
I know, right?
You can't make money on your housing. So I think that like Overton window has not yet shifted that way yet. But it is also a really complicated history of land use and housing developed, like, so the federal role of housing in the United States. It is something that happened in a really terrible way in many places in the United States in terms of like project housing that was built and was completely undermined by the suburbanization and the policy that underwrote like the suburbs in the 1950s. So it's going to, and I think that's where Annie's right, and that it's going to be, there are going to be a lot of smart people weighing in on all kinds of ways, and that there's a lot of history that needs to be addressed, and will make that really important policy, but will also be really challenging for many reasons, good and bad and everywhere in between.
Yeah.
It's super complicated and has a really, really like a very complicated history behind it.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that, and I appreciate Amy bringing that up, is I think that one of the things we forget in the United States that it's, you know, definitely something that, like, as you read more, it sort of comes more to the forefront. You realize it's not in the public conscience as much, at least to folks of our generation, is that public housing in the United States historically, like when it actually started, was mostly for like middle income, like workforce families. And it was only when like there was a conflation of a lot of events that some were related and some were unrelated all around the same time, that we basically had this rapid disinvestment in public housing. We had extraordinary racial segregation, and essentially what was at one point like workforce social housing, frankly, that looks a lot more like what we see in parts of, you know, Western Europe today, became these really, really, really neglected, racially segregated, underfunded, like low-income housing projects that through the middle of the 20th century and beyond gained an awful reputation. But it was actually the fact that the government had stepped away that gave it that reputation. Whereas I think that oftentimes people think of the government being involved in housing is automatically going to result in that, when really I would argue very, very strongly that you need to go back in history even further and also take more of an international lens, because that's a pretty contemporary myth that I think a lot of people, you know, believe, based on, particularly white people believe, based on what they see or have seen in certain communities, that I think it's important that we continue to debunk and make sure that when we have those conversations about the government's involvement, not just in low-income housing, but just in housing in general, that it's rooted in facts and the real history around it.
But Annie, you're trying to upzone California at a time when we have a pandemic. Isn't that a public health disaster waiting to happen?
Well, to be clear, we failed upzoning California before the pandemic. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know if you want to go into like density and overcrowding now or put that on the table, but
yeah, we can leave it at that. But density is not correlated with public health outcomes in COVID. There's a lot of, for anyone that is hearing that argument, it's been debunked.
Yeah. So I guess in closing, I will be posting a litany of extra credit reading for anyone interested, both on COVID and overcrowding, as well as just general housing, like lit review, things that might be a little bit orthogonal to this group, but things that I've really found important and resonant for me, kind of as I've tried to like grasp my fingers around all corners of a lot of these problems of the last few years. Yeah, and I'm sure other folks have a whole lot of insight as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. That was a really exciting conversation, and looking forward to getting to compiling those resources and sending them out to people. You guys can follow both of these smart humans on Twitter. I will send their handles as well. And Amy, anything else you'd like to close with?
No, thanks. Thank you so much, Annie, for taking an evening to chat with all of us.
Yeah, totally. I'm like 2 for 2 now and doing Davis events with Amy. So
That's
it's been fun.
right. Yeah,
Uh,
thanks for always saying yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I'll also include my email in the chat as well, and I'll give it to Jake in case anyone wants to reach out or follow up on certain conversations or, you know, talk about anything. I'm very available, and I've certainly benefited from people offering me that in the past, so I will continue to pay it forward.
Okay, let's all unmute and give snaps into the microphone for our guests. Oh, this is going to be loud. Thank you all so much. And if you want to learn about more exciting webinars, go to studentenergydavis.org and sign up for our mailing list. Okay, that's it for today, folks. Thanks again, and
Thanks,
we will
Jake.
catch you later.
Thanks.
Well,
See ya.
thanks.
Bye.